Imagine you're about to make a choice, but little do you know, somebody's lurking there in the shadows, waiting to flip a switch to force you to choose the way he wants you to choose. Now, you end up choosing the way he wants you to choose without him flipping the switch. You made the decision you wanted to make, so that's a free will choice, right? You didn't have the ability to do otherwise. You couldn't have helped but to choose the way you chose. So is that free? And does that matter for moral responsibility? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. In the last video, which was about 2 years ago, so it's been quite some time, we talked about the consequence argument from Peter von Inwagen. And that said that in order for you to be free, determinism has to be false. Why? Because determinism makes it so that you couldn't do otherwise. We saw objections to the argument, we saw replies to the objections, but today we're going to look at a philosopher named Harry Frankfurt, who provides a scenario that shows us that maybe it's not the case that you need to be able to do otherwise in order to be free. Now, throughout the series, we've seen that incompatibilists have relied on two pillars for free will. Number one, leeway freedom is when you have the ability to do otherwise. Number two, sourcehood freedom is when you are the source of your actions. The consequence argument points out that determinism rules out number one. Harry Frankfurt here is going to say maybe number one is not necessary for free will. So, since the time of Aristotle, the principle of alternative possibilities, or PAP, has been assumed by most philosophers. And that says that a person is morally responsible for what she has done only if she could have done otherwise. Now, you may wonder, aren't we talking about free will? What do you mean moral responsibility? For a lot of philosophers, moral responsibility is tied up so much with free will that it makes sense to talk about them together. But we'll see that those two things can actually be separated. In any case, here's a little scenario to show you where this assumption comes from. Let's say somebody puts a gun to your head and says, "Give me your wallet." You give them the wallet and somebody says, "Why did you give them the wallet?" Well, it wasn't my fault, right? I had to do it. I had no other choice. A lot of people will not hold you morally responsible for that because you had a gun to your head. But consider an alternative situation. This comes from philosopher John Locke. Let's say you fall asleep and somebody carries you into a room, sits you down in front of somebody that's very interesting to talk to, and then locks the door from the outside so that you couldn't get out if you tried. You wake up, you see this person, you're like, "Oh, I wanted to talk to you. This is awesome." And you start talking. Now, Locke says you are sitting in that room of your own free will. And yet, there is something that's hindering you from leaving that room. So you have no choice but to sit in that room. But you chose freely. So it seems like PAP is false. Now, that scenario, for some reasons that we won't get into, isn't quite so tight as Harry Frankfurt's. Harry Frankfurt asks you to consider two people, one Jones and one Black. Now, Jones goes into a voting booth and is going to choose between voting for candidate A and candidate B. Little does Jones know that Black has implanted overnight, and Black is a mad neuroscientist, has implanted overnight a mechanism inside his brain such that if Black flipped the switch, Jones would be forced to vote for candidate A. Now, Jones gets up to the booth and looks at the two candidates and goes with candidate A, and Black doesn't actually have to flip the switch to force him to choose candidate A. Did Jones choose of his own volition? Well, for Frankfurt, he would say, yeah, he did. There was nothing that Black did to force him to choose, right? And yet, there were no alternative possibilities. It wasn't the case that Jones could have looked at that candidate B and actually chose for candidate B. So it seems like the principle of alternative possibilities must be false, because Jones chose freely and yet there were no alternative possibilities. Now, this scenario, Frankfurt says, is an attempt to pull apart two ideas that are typically put together. And that is factors that make an action inevitable, like Black's flipping the switch, and factors that explain an agent's act. Now, typically, these two things are the same. Typically, whatever makes it so that your action is inevitable is also what explains your act. But in this case, what explains the act is Jones's deliberation. And what makes the act inevitable is Black's switch that he could flip. So that's why in most scenarios, it looks like you need the alternative possibilities. But in this scenario, we see that you don't. Peter von Inwagen, whom we saw giving the consequence argument, argues that there must be a little bit of an alternative possibility. There must be what philosophers will call a flicker of freedom. The flicker of freedom here would be formation of an intention to choose candidate B. Jones must have been able to at least form the intention to vote for candidate B, and that was the freedom, even if he was forced then to vote for candidate A. So Jones had at least one alternative, and that was to form that intention. But Frankfurt and his friends all say that's not enough. It's not robust enough. And here's what they mean by robust. It needs to be the case that the agent performs a voluntary action, the agent knows that she can act, and that the action would bring about the alternative. So consider this scenario. And in this Frankfurt cases, there are just scenario after scenario. So I apologize ahead of time. I think they're kind of interesting though. So the scenario goes like this. Let's say that before Jones decides to vote for candidate A, Jones blushes, right? That's the indication to Black that Jones is going to vote for candidate A. Now, if Black doesn't see Jones blush by a certain period of time, by a certain moment of time, I should say, then Black flips the switch. But let's say in this case, Jones does blush. He votes for candidate A without Black's interference. Now, what was the alternative here? Failing to blush? That doesn't seem robust enough. Jones had no idea about the fact that Jones was going to blush or not. So he didn't know there was going to be an alternative to this blushing. And even if he did, what could he do about it? So again, as we said, it doesn't seem like this alternative is robust enough to count for a free will choice. Here's another scenario from Derek Paraboom. Let's say Joe is going to cheat on his taxes. And the only way that Joe can stop from cheating on his taxes if he takes a sip of coffee that is laced with a particular drug that just forces compliance. And now he has no idea that coffee is laced with that drug. So Jones doesn't actually drink the coffee and cheats on his taxes. Was Jones responsible for not drinking the coffee? No, Jones had no idea that that drug was in there, so he didn't know whether or not he could avoid cheating on his taxes by drinking the coffee. So it's not robust enough. Now, that's a pretty strong defense. It leads incompatibilists to change PAP a little bit. So they give an alternative version of PAP, PAP robust we could call it. An agent is only free if that agent has a robust alternative to his or her actions. So now the incompatibilist is not saying that you need just any old alternative. You need one that involves your rational agency in order for your action to be free. Now the prior sign example, the fact that Jones has to blush before voting for candidate A, leads the incompatibilist, who is also a believer in free will, so that would be the libertarian, leads the libertarian to offer a dilemma. This was developed by Whitaker and then Robert Kane. So the dilemma goes as follows. Let's say that it's the case that Jones is going to blush before he chooses to vote for candidate A. Could Jones have voted for candidate B if Jones blushed? Well, if you say no, then you're basically saying determinism is true. You're assuming determinism is true, I should say. But again, if determinism is true, there are no alternative possibilities. So if this is the case, if that's what you're saying, then you've already assumed that there are no alternative possibilities and yet that Jones is free. But that's exactly what we were trying to argue about. The incompatibilist argues that if determinism is true, then there is no moral responsibility. There's no free will. So if this horn of the dilemma is the case, then the person giving the scenario with Jones blushing has already snuck in the conclusion that he wants to prove. Let's say instead, we don't say that Jones blushing forces him to choose candidate A, that he could have chosen candidate B. So indeterminism is true instead, not determinism. We have not assumed determinism to be true. Well, if that's the case, then Black has no idea when to flip that switch, because even if Jones blushes, then Jones could always vote for candidate B. So on this dilemma, either determinism is true and we have begged the question, or indeterminism is true and there still are alternative possibilities. This dilemma is very powerful, and it's led compatibilists to do all kinds of work to try to get around it. The first response is given by Mealy and Robb, and we'll call it the trumping preemption scenario. So let's say at time t1, Black initiates a deterministic physical process inside of Bob's brain so that Bob will steal Ant's car at time t2. We'll call this process P. Now let's say now at time t2, Bob, through indeterministic deliberation, a process we'll call X, decides to steal Anne's car at time t2 anyway. And let's say that process X, the indeterministic deliberation, trumps process P. Bob's action is indeterministic, so that avoids horn 1 of the dilemma. And yet Black's backup ensures that there are no alternative possibilities, avoiding horn 2. Now, you may wonder, what about this trumping idea? How does one process trump another? How does this all work? Well, they give an analogy from philosopher Jonathan Schaeffer, and that is, imagine a major and a general are standing in front of a bunch of soldiers, and both the general and the major say march at the same time. Who caused the soldiers to march? We probably would say the general, because the general trumps the major. Even though if the general hadn't said anything, they would still have marched because the major would then be causing them to march. So that's an example of a trumping scenario. Now, a lot of philosophers don't like this because in this scenario, we have a clear hierarchy militarily, whereas we don't necessarily have that in the mind and the brain. And this is probably true. I mean, if you think about it anyway, what caused them to march is probably whatever they heard first, right? It's not like they were sitting there thinking like, okay, the general and the major both said it. I better listen to the general and not worry about the major. No, whenever they heard march, they went, right? It was probably the physical cause was the audio hitting their eardrums, right? So probably there's something to that, but there's a more damning objection to this scenario. Let's say instead of process X, that indeterministic deliberation causing Bob to steal Anne's car at time t2, let's say instead process X said that Bob should not steal that car. What would happen then? If P jumps in front of X all of a sudden, now it looks like determinism. P is doing all the work here. P is forcing Bob to do what he does. So the whole thing is deterministic. But what if X wins? Then it looks like indeterminism is true. Bob actually had an alternative possibility. So it seems like we're right back to where we started in the dilemma. Let's give you another scenario. This one is from David Hunt, and we'll call it the blockage scenario. So let's say there are two people, Scarlet and Mustard. I don't know where he got these names from, but let's break this up into two situations. In situation A, Scarlet decides to kill Mustard at time t1. Now, in this situation, there's nothing that forces Scarlet to do so. Scarlet does so of her own volition, and there are no crazy neuroscientists. But in situation B, everything is identical to situation A, except for someone has, again, mad scientist, has now blocked all neural pathways that would possibly divert the decision for Scarlet to kill Mustard at time t1. But again, situation B is identical to situation A, except for now we have these blockages put in there. But Scarlet seems to still be choosing of her own volition to kill Mustard. It's just that those neural pathways were inaccessible for her that would have given her the alternative possibilities of not killing Mustard. So the argument goes, Scarlet was free in situation A. Situation B has an identical causal history, so Scarlet is free in situation B. That's a pretty good scenario. Indeterminists will respond that actually the blockage changes the situation into a deterministic one. If the neural events can't bump up into the blockage, if there's truly no indeterministic situation that could have gone other ways, then the blockage scenario has turned to everything deterministic. And they give the following counter scenario. Imagine atoms falling through a void. In situation C, the atoms fall through this void, they go straight down. Now it's deterministic that they go straight down, but what's indeterministic is that they could swoop one way or another. They happen not to, but in situation C, but they could, that they have the ability to do so. Now in situation D, put some kind of empty frictionless tube atoms have to go through, and now they couldn't swerve one way or another. Their swerving has been blocked. Situation D, these philosophers will argue, eliminates all indeterminacy. Even though the atom does the same thing in situation C and D, D is a deterministic situation. So the tube changes the modal structure. And in the same way, Hunt's blocks change the modal structure in the brain. Things are definitely getting subtle here. The question is, does blocking off those neural pathways change the situation that we're in? Is it the case that everything got deterministic, or is it the causal history that matters? That's the debate there. Another objection to the dilemma comes from Derek Pereboom. He constructs a Frankfurt case where the prior sign is causally necessary but not sufficient for the effect. a scenario that's specifically designed to deal with this dilemma. So let's say Joe wants to commit tax fraud, and Joe's only alternative to committing tax fraud will happen if Joe achieves a certain level of attentivity to his moral reasons for not doing so. But attaining that level of attentivity is not causally sufficient for him to not choose tax evasion. He still could have chosen one way or another. Now, again, a crazy neuroscientist puts a device inside of Joe's brain such that if he achieves that level of attentiveness, then it will force him to commit tax evasion. He never achieves that level of attentiveness, so he commits tax fraud on his own. The device remains idle. How does this work? How does this avoid the dilemma? Well, the prior sign was necessary for the action, but it's not sufficient for the action, so libertarian freedom still remains. And that means the action is voluntary. He could have done otherwise. However, there really were no alternatives in this scenario. He had to choose to commit tax evasion. Now, you might respond that he could have chosen to achieve that level of attentiveness, and therefore everything would have been different. Even if he had been forced to choose to commit tax evasion, things would have been different. He would have made a moral choice. But Paraboom says this isn't robust enough because he didn't know that achieving that level of attentiveness would have forced him to make the decision because that device would have been clicked on. Another possible response here is to say that Joe is only derivatively responsible for committing tax evasion. It was derivative of his fault for not achieving that level of attentiveness. And he did have a robust alternative for achieving that level of attentiveness. So imagine a guy named Biff decides to get drunk. Now, when Biff gets drunk, Biff gets angry. And Biff is going to do some bad stuff. Is Biff responsible for the stuff that he does when he's drunk? Well, only derivatively. Biff is really responsible for the drinking itself. And then what happens after that, there is a derivative responsibility, but not a direct responsibility. In the same way, Joe is only derivatively responsible for the fraud. He's directly responsible for not achieving that level of attentiveness. Now, the possible responses are, first, that you only have direct responsibility here if you assume that robust alternative possibilities are necessary, which begs the question in favor of the leeway incompatibilist, the person that thinks that there must be alternative possibilities. Second, Joe and Biff are different. Joe could have always achieved that level of attentiveness, so his responsibility isn't quite derivative in the way that Biff's is. A third possibility comes from Carl Ginnett, and it's the timing response. At time t1, the precise time that Joe chooses to avoid taxes, he could have chosen to attend to moral reasons instead. And that is the robust alternative. Again, another scenario. Black, our favorite crazy neuroscientist, implants a device inside of Jones's brain that forces Jones to kill Smith. We'll call that process B of killing Smith by time t3 if he hasn't done so already by time t2, or I should say at time t3 if he hasn't done so already by time t2. Now, it happens to be the case that Jones kills Smith, he does B, at time t1, well before times t2 or t3. Now, Jones is not responsible for doing B by t3. He couldn't have avoided that. But he is responsible for doing B at time t1. He did have alternatives at that moment. Now, you may say these don't seem different. One way or another, he kills Smith. He does B, right? That's because, Ginnett says, they are morally equivalent, but they are metaphysically distinct. Responsibility tracks the metaphysical situation at the time of the action. Paraboom responds that Jones's blameworthiness can't be explained by having this alternative at time t1. And here's the scenario that he gives. Imagine that Adam is causally determined to press a button that will cause an explosion of a bomb between time t0 and time t3. He's causally determined to push this button, and the bomb will blow up at time t4. And it'll do so at t4 no matter when he pressed the button. Adam realizes that when he pushes the button isn't going to make a difference, so he decides to go at t1. Now, on incompatibilism, he has no responsibility because there's no robust alternative to him pressing the button at time t3. The timing freedom doesn't ground responsibility. But what's important here is that these Frankfurt scenarios have really changed the debate. Now it's no longer so important for incompatibilists that we have leeway freedom. Now they're more worried about sourcehood freedom. It's no longer the case that we're worried about, do you have alternative possibilities? Now we're worried about, is it a decision that comes from you? Are you the source of your decisions? So it's really changed the game here. Very interesting scenarios. But yeah, let's talk about general abilities next time. I'll see you then. Adios.